Namaste, and welcome to our continuing series on the life divine with our beloved Ranga. We are on page 391, the eternal and the individual, beginning with the line, "So far, there need be no real difficulty or confusion." So we'll go back a little bit, summarize
Yes.
previous para.
The previous paragraph we are summarizing now. In my words, not from those words. What do we mean by the absolute? We mean something greater than ourselves and the cosmos, a supreme reality, God, transcendent being, without which nothing could exist. Indians call it Brahman, Europeans call it the absolute, because it is free of all relatives, which can exist only by the absolute, which contains them and their principles and truths. Yet it is something more than the sum of all relatives. So now he is saying the Indians call it Brahman, the Europeans call it the absolute, because it is free of all relatives, which can exist only by the absolute, which contains them and their principles and truths. Yet it is something more than the sum of all relatives. Each and every relative or relative, I don't know how you're going to pronounce it, is contained in the absolute. But the absolute is not merely the total sum of all relatives. It is something more than that. The absolute is ineffable. That's what he said in the previous one. Okay? So now we read today's para.
Yes, and we have read it previously.
I'll go sentence by sentence.
Very good.
So far, there need be no real difficulty or confusion. But we readily go on, led by the mind's habit of oppositions, of thinking by distinctions and pairs of contraries, to speak of it as not only bound by the limitations of the relative, but as if it were bound by its freedom from limitations, inexorably empty of all power for relations, and in its nature incapable of them, something hostile in its whole being to relativity and its eternal contrary. So normally when you think of the absolute, he's saying that we feel that it's the opposite of the relative. It's not necessarily the opposite. It contains all the relatives. Now, next thing he says that you feel that it has to be infinite, it has to be omniscience, omnipotence, omnipresence. It cannot be anything else. That's what a normal mind is led to think. That's what he's saying. Okay? So, in other words, it does not have the freedom to get rid of the limitation of omniscience, omnipotence. It has to be omnipotent. God cannot be weak. He has to be absolutely most powerful.
In that understanding.
Yes. Even if we don't speak it that way, that's what we understand and picture it.
Yes.
Picture it to ourselves. How can God be weak? How can he be unconscious?
Yeah. How can he be ignorant?
How can he be ignorant? That's right. So that's a mistake we make. That's what he's going to say. Okay, something hostile in the being to relativity. By this false step of our logic, we get into an impasse or impasse. How do you pronounce it?
Impasse.
Impasse. Okay. It's a French word, impasse.
Impasse, yeah.
It's a dead end. Okay, so our own existence and the existence of the universe become not only a mystery, but logically inconceivable. Okay. Our own existence and existence of the universe become not only a mystery, because then what is the divine? Is it not here? We have started with the concept of Advaita. There is only one ultimate reality. So if the world is the opposite, it is contradicting our own hypothesis. So that's what he's saying. By this false step, our logic, we get into an impasse. our own existence and the existence of the universe become not only a mystery but logically inconceivable. Because on the one hand, we are saying God is there everywhere. He is there in the cosmos, He is there in the individual. Yet we are saying He cannot be finite. He cannot be ignorant. So it's a contradiction, logically contradiction. If the mind thinks in that way. Okay, so for we get by that to an absolute which is incapable of relativity and exclusive of all relatives, and yet the cause or at least the support of relativity and the container, truth, and substance of all relatives. So the idea that God has to be only omnipotent, omniscient is not valid. He has the freedom, if he wants, to become weak. He has the freedom to limit himself. Okay, that's what Srila is saying. We have then only one logical, illogical way of escape out of the impasse. We have to suppose the imposition of the world as a self-effective illusion or an unreal temporal reality on the eternity of the formless, relationless absolute. So if you start from that idea that the divine is only perfect, then what is the solution? How to explain the existence of the world and the individual? The Mayavadic solution or the Buddhistic solution?
Exactly.
It is unreal.
Exactly.
That's the solution. Okay. But doesn't fit our concept. We started with Advaita. They are not starting with Advaita. So we have to suppose the imposition of the world as a self-effective illusion or an unreal temporal reality on the eternity of the formless, relationless absolute. This imposition is made by our misleading individual consciousness, which falsely sees Brahman in the figure of the cosmos, as a man mistakes a rope for a serpent. This is a classical example of Shankaracharya. We are thinking that it is limited. Actually, we are making a mistake. Our perceptions are not correct. As we mistake a serpent for mistake a rope for a serpent.
Mistakes a rope for a serpent.
I might as well mention here that Shankara's philosophy is, he believes in the Advaita philosophy. He says that everything is one. So, how are we? We are not seeing in the world and the individual forms in the right way. We are seeing it as an illusion. Our sight is wrong. Our sight is wrong. Our hearing is wrong. Our senses are wrong. So, he gives 3-4 examples. One is the mirage in the desert. There is no water, no trees, but on a hot day, you will see vibrations. Even in Pondicherry, you will see on the road, these heat waves. Okay, you can see them sometimes. So this gives you the impression of flowing water and trees, and sometimes these vibrations go upwards, so they feel like trees. That is one image. There is nothing there, but you are seeing it in that way. The other example is the one moon shining in troubled waters. There appears to be many moons. So this is the many you are seeing here is an unreality. That's the second example. Then the third example is the shell on the seashore. The shell. You feel that there is silver on it. Okay? But there is no silver. It's only nacre. It's a device of nature to give a certain polish and a silvery look on the seashell. And the most famous example is the serpent and the rope. You are walking at night and your leg hits a rope, but you feel it's a snake. Daytime you come and see it's only a rope. So you are mistaking the actual reality for something else because of your limitation and your ignorance. If the ignorance goes away, you will see the reality. This is Shankara's philosophy. Not the Mayavadan. The Mayavadan say, no, this is unreal. But Shankara says, no, you are seeing it wrong. Okay? So, Srivendra goes one step more and says that neither we agree with the Buddhists nor we agree fully with Shankara, although he's brilliant the way he has explained. Srivendra gives him very high marks. But behind the forms, there is a reality. It's not that the reality is not there, the reality is there. Okay, so that's the. So, this imposition is made by our misleading individual consciousness, which falsely sees Brahman in the figure of the cosmos, as a man mistakes a rope for the serpent. But since neither our individual consciousness is itself a relative supported by the Brahman and only existent in it, not a real reality, or since in its reality it is itself the Brahman, it is the Brahman after all which imposes on itself in us this delusion and mistakes in some figure of its own consciousness an existing rope for a non-existing snake, imposes on its own indeterminable pure reality the semblance of a universe. I don't think we have read this. I think we are reading it for the first time. Anyway.
It's interesting that Brahman is imposing this on us.
Yes, that's right. So, in other words, it is Brahman who is doing this imposition. It is he himself. So we have to explain that. Okay, so it is the Brahman after all which imposes on itself in us this delusion and mistakes in some figure of his own consciousness an existing rope for a non-existing snake, imposes on its own indeterminable pure reality the semblance of a universe, or if it does not impose it on its own consciousness, it is on a consciousness derived from it and dependent on it, a projection of itself into Maya. So, by this explanation, nothing is explained. The original contradiction stands where it was, unreconciled, and we have only stated it over again in other terms. So, how to explain the universe and all? So, the divine is creating the universe and limiting himself. So, we have contradicted ourselves. So, it's an explanation which the Mayavadins and the Buddhists, Mayavadins give. But it is not satisfactory, Srivendra says, because it's contradictory. Okay, so by this explanation, nothing is explained. The original contradiction stands where it was, unreconciled, and we have only stated it over again in other terms. It looks as if, by attempting to arrive at an explanation by means of intellectual reasoning, we have only befogged ourselves by the delusion of our own uncompromising logic. In other words, logic is not applicable there. We have imposed on the Absolute the imposition which our too presumptuous reasoning has practiced on our own intelligence. We have transformed our mental difficulty in understanding the world manifestation into an original impossibility for the Absolute to manifest itself in world at all. But the Absolute obviously finds no difficulty in world manifestation and no difficulty either in a simultaneous transcendence of world manifestation. So we have to change our way of looking at things. The divine he has the freedom to limit himself, to reduce his own power, to reduce his own.
To be the opposite of what he is.
Yes. He has the power to become the opposite of what he is. So, and this also is very reasonable, because we can give one example which will immediately make it obvious why, if he has to manifest himself, he has to reduce his power, reduce his consciousness. One simple example will be very clear. Okay. I usually give this one example. I want to knock a nail into the wall. How much force am I going to use? I am omnipotent. Am I going to use my omnipotence?
No.
If I use my full force, I'm going to break the wall.
You break the wall.
And if I use too little, I'm going to not succeed. So I have to use a power which is limited to be effective. Therefore, the divine must have the power to limit himself. Because the world is limitation, so he has to limit himself for manifestation. So that's very simple. So naturally, you can't say the divine is only omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent.
I want to insert a joke.
Yeah. Go ahead.
This fellow is trying to put a nail in the wall with the head of the nail against the wall. And his friend comes and he says, "You idiot, that's for the other wall."
Yeah. The second one is even more stupid than the first one.
Okay, back to reality.
Yeah. So, but the absolute obviously finds no difficulty in world manifestation and no difficulty either in a simultaneous transcendence of world manifestation. So, the Buddhistic logic is acceptable because they are saying that God is up there, but this is not God here. They are two different things. So, they are not wrong. They are saying it is illusion. If you want the divine, you have to go up there. You will never find the divine here. That's their logic and their way of looking at things.
But how are they wrong? How are they right?
How are they right? Because if you want the divine, you have to go there. They are not starting with the Advaita philosophy.
Okay.
They are not starting with that.
So all of this to them is wrong,
Yeah.
false,
Yes.
illusion.
You are experiencing it absolutely in a wrong way. Then, if you challenge them and say, "But still I am seeing," so their answer will be that you are using logic. If you go to the spiritual plane of consciousness, you will see that what we are saying is true. And that's true because at that level, the world becomes unreal.
Okay.
So, in other words, we come back to Sri Aurobindo philosophy that there are grades and worlds, and each world has got its own way of looking at things and also its own rules and laws. So, that explains. So, all of them are right, partially.
Yes.
That's
At
all.
certain stages.
Yes.
Good.
Okay, so for our intellectual has no difficulty either in a simultaneous transcendence of world manifestation. So, he can be omnipotent and yet he can be also weak. He can be infinite but he can also be finite at the same time. Okay, that's what he's saying. So, we have to start with that idea. The difficulty exists only for our mental limitations which prevent us from grasping the supramental rationality of the coexistence of the infinite and the finite, or seizing the nodus of the unconditioned with the conditioned. And this in spiritual experience, everybody has experienced that. The finite and the infinite are both involved in each other. The finite is there in the infinite and the infinite is there in the finite. Again, Blake's lines.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so that is impossible for the logic to understand. So you have to use a logic which is infinite logic, not the limited logic. Not mental logic, but supramental logic. That's what Shabda says. So, for our intellectual rationality, these are opposites. For the absolute reason, they are interrelated and not essentially conflicting expressions of one and the same reality. The consciousness of infinite existence is other than our mind consciousness and sense consciousness, greater and more capacious, for it includes them as minor terms of its workings, and the logic of infinite existence is other than our intellectual logic. So, the logic of the mind is very rational and very applicable. It has to be used at the mental level. But the moment you go out of the mental level and go somewhere else, the rules change and the laws change. Logic does not hold good anymore there. That's what it's saying. Okay? It reconciles in its great primal facts of being what to our mental view, concerned as it is with words and ideas derived from secondary facts, are irreconcilable contraries. Level 1, level 2, level 3. Level 1, our normal consciousness. We do see opposites and they are valid. You have to see them as opposites. If you think light and darkness are the same, you'll be in trouble. If a criminal and a good man are the same, you'll be in trouble. So you have to, it is logical to accept the dualities. Then you go to level 2. Those things which seem to be contraries are not contraries but reconcilables. You do see, in level 2, you do see the opposites. But they are not opposites anymore, they are complementary aspects. Obverse and reverse of a coin.
So let's take an example of good and evil.
Okay. Yeah, we always come back to that.
Yeah.
You have the Nazi problem you have. Okay. I've explained that and I will again tell you the same thing. Cruelty and kindness.
Okay.
Okay. So that is, there is a force behind both of them. And that force is reducing itself and you seem to see it in a different way. Okay. This is an interesting question, so we'll go. Take a wind. I'll give 2 examples. Take a wind, okay? When it is very gentle and soft and sweet, you enjoy it. You call it good. That same wind, again, when it increases velocity and becomes 200 miles an hour, you feel it is bad, it is destructive. It is tearing down trees, it is doing this, it is doing that. So, again, the same thing of cruelty and kindness is the same thing. It is the way you are perceiving it. Actually, it is only the force doing something. Okay. The force is the same. Still not possible.
I can accept the wind analogy,
but not the cruelty.
But not the cruelty.
Okay. The cruelty and the kindness is, there is a force which is neither this nor that, but expressing itself in this way. The force that is the slow wind is kindness. The force that is destroying trees is a cruelty. If that wind were a person, you would say it's cruel. Wouldn't you?
Mm-hmm.
So that's
good example.
When you go there, you see that it is the same thing, essentially the same thing, but taken on different aspects. I'll try and give you another example. I have to remember it. Red and blue, the colors, they are opposites. So, let's say, and what is red? It is vibrating at a certain level. Okay? There is the vibrational quality is the same. Let us say 50 times it is vibrating. It's measured by hertz. No? I think it is measured by megahertz or hertz. Okay. So, but it is vibrating only 50 times. But its range is so much. If its range is so much, the vibrational quality is the same. But now it is vibrating over a bigger area. Its character has changed. All colors are essentially, the vibrational quality is changing. But the vibration is the same.
I know this in music. I know it in music.
Exactly. Apply the same thing here.
But I want to ask you about Sri Aurobindo's leg being broken.
Yeah, okay.
How do we reconcile those two forces?
Again, the same thing. In the physical world, there's a divine force, but there's also evil forces. How does that happen? Because when the divine is creating, okay, he has to create every possibility.
Okay.
So he has to create light, he has to create darkness. If he has created good, he has to create also the opposite. In fact, the evil forces have come from God. They have been created from there. But on the way, they get distorted. If you remember that there is a diminution and a distortion also.
Yes, Mother speaks of this.
Yeah. So they have gone wrong. In fact, in our Indian philosophy, we call it Diti and Aditi. Aditi is the mother of the gods. Aditi is one singleness. And Diti is two. It's breaking up. So Diti is the mother of the Asuras. And Aditi is the mother of the gods. They are actually half brothers. In fact, in our scriptures, very often they speak of these gods and sometimes the asuras. They are half brothers. So, and Sri Aurobindo said that he was guarding mother and he was a little careless about himself.
Yes.
Because the hostile forces were trying to delay his work. And they did succeed. First they broke his leg. Then they brought in the war. And his work got disturbed. So he could not finish the work. It was mother who had to finish the work. I'll read from For Our Intellectual Rationality. The last 5 lines of the page 392. Okay. For our intellectual rationality, these are opposites. For the absolute reason, they are interrelated and not essentially conflicting expressions of one and the same reality. The consciousness of infinite existence is other than our mind consciousness and sense consciousness, greater and more capacious, for it includes them as minor terms of its workings, and the logic of infinite existence is other than our intellectual logic. It reconciles in its great primal facts of being what to our mental view concerned as it is with words and ideas derived from secondary facts are irreconcilable contraries. Note, concerned as it is with words and ideas. When you are using words, you are limiting the unlimited. That's the whole problem. So, level 1, dualities, opposites. Level 2, the spiritual planes of consciousness, they are not opposites anymore, they are complementary aspects. At level 3, they are not even complementary aspects, they are all one. So, one divides itself into 2 and divides it to infinite at the 3rd level. So, that's what he's saying. So, now Sri Aurobindo is explaining what is the mistake that logic is making. Not logic, but the human mind.
So shall we read it first?
Yes, we'll read it. Our mistake is that in trying to define the indefinable, we think we have succeeded when we have described by an all-exclusive negation this absolute which we are yet compelled to conceive of as a supreme positive and the cause of all positives. Positives means omniscience, omnipotence, omnipresent, and the opposites are the negatives. Okay, so it is not surprising that so many acute thinkers with their eye on the facts of being and not on verbal distinctions should be driven to infer that the absolute is a fiction of the intelligence, an idea born of words and verbal dialectics, a zero, non-existent, to conclude that an eternal becoming is the only truth of our existence. The ancient seers spoke indeed of Brahman negatively. They said of it, Neti Neti. It is not this, it is not that. But they took care also to speak of it positively. They said of it too, it is this, it is that, it is all. For they saw that to limit it either by positive or negative definitions was to fall away from its truth. Brahman, they said, is matter, is life, is mind, is supermind, is cosmic delight, is Satchidananda. Yet it cannot really be defined by any of these things, not even by our largest conception of Satchidananda. In the world as we see it, for our mental consciousness, however high we carry it, we find that to every positive there is a negative. But the negative is not a zero. Indeed, whatever appears to us a zero is packed with force, teeming with power of existence, full of actual potential or potential contents. Neither does the existence of a negative make its corresponding positive non-existent or an unreality. It only makes the positive an incomplete statement of the truth of things, and even, we may say, of the positive's own truth. For the positive and the negative exist not only side by side, but in relation to each other and by each other. They complete and would, to the all view, which a limited mind cannot reach, explain one another. Each by itself is not really known. We only begin to know it in its deeper truth when we can read into it the suggestions of its apparent opposite. It is through such a profounder Catholic intuition and not by exclusive logical oppositions that our intelligence ought to approach the absolute. It's a very big para, quite a big para, and again the same ideas come up. So, what are the positives and the negatives? Only we have to make clear what is meant by positive, what is meant by negative. Okay, so now Srimda is saying, what is the mistake we make? Our mistake is that in trying to define the indefinable, we think we have succeeded when we have described by an all-exclusive negation this absolute, which we are yet compelled to conceive of as a supreme positive and the cause of all positives. So, positives again, let's take the omniscience, omnipotence, omnipresence. Okay.
We cannot see the negative.
Yeah, that's right. That's what he's saying. That's a mistake we make. Thinking that the divine is limited by his omniscience and omnipotence. You can think of him as being so powerful that he can reduce his own omnipotence. Again, we come back to the examples we have given. Okay, so. And all. So, positives are clear. Negatives are, if you take immortality as a positive, death is its negative. If you take good as a positive, evil is its negative. Okay? If you take the infinite as a positive, the finite is the negative. It is not surprising that so many acute thinkers, with their eye on the facts of being and not on verbal distinctions, should be driven to infer that the absolute is a fiction of the intelligence, an idea born of words and verbal dialectics, a zero, non-existent, and to conclude that an eternal becoming is the only truth of our existence. Because, and in this he is including also Buddhism and even Shankara. Okay, he gets confused by words. Shankara is not confused, but when he expresses himself in words, the other than misunderstanding him. Sri Aurobindo admits that Shankara's philosophy is very deep and can be understood in many ways and misunderstood also in many ways. Okay, so what's he saying here? He's saying that so many acute thinkers, he is including in this Buddha as well as, not Buddha but Buddhism. Okay. And Shankara is also, Shankara is on the borderline. Okay. So let's see what he's saying. It is not surprising so many acute thinkers, with their eye on the facts of being, not on verbal distinctions, but should be driven to infer that the absolute is a fiction of the intelligence. The physical world is becoming. There is constant movement here. When your consciousness goes to the level 2 in the nirvana consciousness, that is so real that this appears to be unreal. So, many there is no such thing as an absolute. That's what they say. You are going into a zero. This is the physical world of action, and you are going into a place where there is no action and no features. There is no absolute. That's what they say. Those who have gone up to the level 2. But if you go to level 3, you will see that the positives contain the negatives, and the negatives here, down here, contain the positives. God is here in matter, and there the potentiality of matter is there. So they include each other. They don't exclude each other. But if you go to level 2, in the spiritual planes of consciousness, you are excluding each other. World is unreal, Brahman is real. And if you are here, the world is real and Brahman is unreal. Okay, so verbal dialectics is zero. Because, again we come back to that, you remember the experience we had? We had an experiment. You start with a glass of water and make it wide, 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 wide. So wide as the infinite, you don't see the glass anymore. It has gone beyond your reach. What are you seeing? If you are seeing water, then you are an Advaitin. But if you bring someone who has not participated in the experience and ask him, he will say, I am seeing nothing. It's a zero. So there is no word, there is no language we can explain that both are real. It is something which seems to be zero, and yet it is full of potentialities. So that is what Srimad is saying. Don't use logic. Use supramental logic, which includes both. Okay. So the ancient sages spoke of it indeed as Brahman negatively. They said, it is not this, it is not this. What they mean is, there are no features. If you think of a feature, God is beyond that. Brahman is beyond that. He is beyond blue, he is beyond red, he is beyond good, he is beyond evil, he is beyond form, he is beyond formless, everything. That's what is meant by Neti Neti, Naiti, Naiti, Naiti.
But they also spoke of it positively.
As positively. That means he is everything, exactly. That was the ancient sages, okay, not the later sages. He goes on making a distinction between the earlier Vedanta and the later Vedanta. The later Vedanta is Shankaracharya's interpretation in the 8th century AD. Whereas the earlier is the Vedic rishis. Okay, the earlier Vedanta is the Vedic rishis and the Upanishads, where they admit the Advaita philosophy and the everything is the divine. Advaita. There is no difference. The divine is everywhere. But the later 8th century AD, Shankara introduced the idea of Mayavada. So the idea of Mayavada came in and illusion came in. Okay, so the ancient sages, when he means original Vedanta, spoke indeed of Brahman negatively. They said of it, Neti Neti, it is not this, it is not this. But they took care also to speak of it positively. They said of it too, it is this, it is that, it is all. For they saw that to limit it either by positive or negative definitions was to fall away from its truth. because they went to the third level. Okay, that's why. Brahman, they said, is matter, is life, is mind, is supermind, is cosmic delight, is Satchidananda. I'll tell you how the Vedas were the ones that reconciled everything. They said very clearly, heaven is my father and the earth is my mother. In other words, there is no contradiction between the two. So the Vedas had intimations of the supermind. There is no doubt about it. But there is no philosophy there. The Vedas are only experiences, no philosophy. And they are heard truths, they are shrutis. The Vedas are not created by human beings. They are not writings of human beings. They are heard and recorded. Heard and recorded. They are not human creations. All the rishis. Even Srirangam used, in fact, all that Srirangam has written is not through mind and logic. It is all it is coming from the silent mind. Into silent mind, he is just writing. Okay, so in the world as we see it, for our mental consciousness, however high we may carry it, we find that to every positive there is a negative. But the negative is not a zero. Indeed, whatever appears to us a zero is packed with force, teeming with power of existence, full of actual and potential contents. Neither does the existence of the negative make its correct corresponding positive non-existent or an unreality. It only makes the positive an incomplete positive when the negative exist not only side by side, but in relation to each other. Is that the one?
Just a little bit above that.
A little higher up. But the negative is not a zero. Indeed, whatever appears to us a zero is packed with force, teeming with power of existence, full of actual or potential contents. Actual or potential. Note that. Neither does the existence of the negative make its corresponding positive non-existent or an unreality. It only makes the positive an incomplete statement of the truth of things, and even, we may say, of its positive's own truth. For the positive and the negative exist not only side by side, but in relation to each other and by each other. They complete and would, to the all view, which a limited mind cannot reach, explain one another. Each by itself is not really known. We only begin to know it in its deeper truth when we can read into it the suggestions of its apparent opposite. It is through such a profounder Catholic intuition and not by exclusive logical oppositions that our intelligence ought to approach the absolute. So, in this context, we can also say that when science is going outwards and experiencing the physical world and finding truths there, they will never come to the absolute truth unless they go to Brahman. If they go to Brahman, they will understand the physical world.
Yes.
They will never be able to understand the physical world fully unless they go there. That's what he's saying. If you want to simplify this whole thing, remember that the infinite contains the finite, and the finite contains the infinite also potentially inside. This is what it is all about. But for logic, it's not possible. Black cannot be white. But for this spiritual consciousness, it is very possible. That's the whole thing.
Thank you, Ranga. Namaste all.